First and foremost, condolences. The brutal end of 23-year-old Gus Davies was horrific in every sense of the word. Gus was known to the person that had taken his life, and that was Robert Field, and they had been childhood friends. They had known each other since they were children. These two men were described as very good friends and even lived together in a rented studio flat in Brackley at the time of the M. Gus Davies and Robert Field, who were from Brackley in Northamptonshire, lives were so entwined with each other when they started drug dealing. With what was supposed to be a partnership between friends where Gus and Robert could build a reputation and live a life of luxury, the men quickly got their hands on Class A, like White and H. They then set up a line where bulk messages were sent out to potential customers across the town, and sales had picked up rapidly and were described as good. Together, both men started selling the drug. At just 23 years old, Robert Field had built up a reputation of being a competent dealer. He was the workhorse. He was resourceful and committed to help the drug operation operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, the fact that Robert and Gus started dealing was supposed to be a partnership, 50-50. However, police says that all the evidence pointed to the fact that Robert Fields was considered nothing more than a runner in the operation, while Gus Davies was considered the crime boss and the leader. Under Gus's direction, Class A was packaged and put into zip bags or separated into quarters and halves and then sold on to other dealers and users. The operation was thriving, booming even. However, when Robert Field was robbed of £45,000 and Class A by two other dealers from Birmingham allegedly, Gus was dismayed. Number one, he did not like the fact that other criminals would try to rob one of his workers, let alone a person he called a mate, and for this robbery to take place at their studio flat in Old Town was a bitter pill to swallow because nobody really knew where the drug was kept, especially the money. And number two, £45,000 was a lot of money that would take time to build back up again. So when Gus looked at Robert and noticed that Robert did not seem to be too bothered about the fact that he had been robbed, Gus entertained the idea that a robbery could have been staged. Thus, this meant that Robert Field was no longer loyal. It made matters worse because rumours had been circulating around the town that Robert had grown tired of Gus. It was well known that Robert Field wanted to be the main drug dealer across all areas of Northamptonshire and wanted to eliminate any and every and all competition, even if that meant his own friend. That simple idea festered inside Gus Davies's head until it took a life on its own and then morphed into something bigger, and then Gus had no choice but to confront his friend. According to reports on the 22nd of June 2018, Robert Field and Gus Davies had got into a disagreement over the fact that Robert had been robbed of the £45,000. Robert's lack of retribution or seeking out revenge, Gus began to look at Robert in a different light, and Gus was said to have asked Robert what happened to the money and the drug, and how comes people knew where we kept the stash. Robert did not want to go over the details again, and when Gus Davies confronted Robert about the fact of the robbery, right there and then, the 10+ years of friendship had fractured and splintered and was no more. It was now completely void. At the flat in Old Town, items were thrown and voices were raised before doors were slammed, and tempers were raging. The truth was Robert Field had told people that he was doing most of the work, selling the drug, and Robert was making little to no money, while Gus was idolised. People looked at Gus as though he was the big-time drug dealer whom has ran a smooth operation, but Robert was working day in and day out, and Gus let everyone know that Robert was a worker and not a crime boss. Robert did not like being looked down upon by Gus. So, in the confines of the Old Town flat, with neither man willing to back down, and Robert not being forthcoming, Gus had armed himself with a blade, and then he had charged. Now, it's important to say it's not known if Gus was actually going to use the blade on Robert, or if the blade was just used to get the dealer and his friend to admit if he had staged a robbery that actually took place at the flat that the both men shared. But in that moment, the two men had brawled in the Old Town studio flat, and in that course of that scuffle, jabs and hooks were thrown. Robert Field actually managed to take the blade off Gus, and then Robert had thrown his freedom out of the window when he gripped that blade and then launched himself back at his childhood friend. Robert Field had launched himself at Gus in the Old Town flat and then started to blade in a frenzied and out of control motion. Robert Field was so out of control that he had targeted vital and sensitive parts of Gus Davies, which included the neck, making contact with major arteries, and the force used, according to pathologists, was described as substantial force. Robert did not kill his own friend because he lost control in the heat of the moment. Robert had killed Gus in such a heinous and catastrophic way because he was tired of not being looked at as an equal. Robert Field had bladed Gus Davies 325 times. Again, that's 325 times. That right there shows that Robert's intention was to commit an M, plain and simple. So, once the action was complete and Gus Davies was no longer breathing and had gone cold to the touch, Robert had watched while Gus struggled to breathe and his heart stop. In that tense and stifled silence, Robert then set to work. Robert had knocked on a friend's door and asked for gloves, bin liners, spade and also a saw. When asked what was going on and what they were for, Robert says DIY. Only Robert had other ideas, sinister ideas. In the days following the M of Gus Davies, Robert had slowly got rid of his friend by taking off parts and then putting them into bin liners. Under the cover of darkness, Robert then left the studio flat, carrying bin liners, and then made his way to the wooded area which was roughly 2 miles away, where the bags were then discarded under shrubbery. Now, because Gus Davies was not found in his entirety, the family were forced to hold 2 funerals for Gus. A senior investigating officer says that the M of Gus Davies was one of the most violent and despicable crimes they had witnessed in their 28 years of policing. Now, when Robert was arrested, in the police interview room, Robert was quick to tell investigating officers that he and Gus were childhood friends. Robert went on to say that when he had taken the blade off Gus, which was not challenged by the police, this was self-defense. However, investigating officers says that Robert's actions went far above that of self-defense. Again, Gus had been bladed 325 times, which means, in effect, Gus was treated as nothing more than a pincushion. Robert Field was put on remand for 250 plus days before his case was heard in court, and on the first day of trial, under the advice of his defence team, Robert changed his plea to guilty and he was jailed for life for the M, with a minimum term set of 15 years. Gus Davies' family did their best to try and dilute the fact that technically Gus had challenged Robert with the blade first in the Old Town flat, and Gus Davies was still a drug dealer whom actively made a lot of money selling Class A. Again, we don't know if Gus Davies was actually going to use the blade on Robert Field before Robert Field took that blade. So, no matter what people's thoughts and opinions, even if Gus Davies did bad, he did not deserve to die for his actions. So the question is, does the crime match the sentence? Let me know in the comments. Stay safe.